Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to the sea. So, if you haven't already, dim the lights, tuck yourself in, and let your phone slowly overheat on the pillow beside you. Because tonight, we're not rushing through history's storms or heroic battles. We're settling onto the wooden benches of an ancient warship, not a glamorous ship of legend, mind you. Not a mighty armada painted on a museum wall, but a long, creaking vessel, crowded with sweaty men, questionable hygiene, and the faint smell of fish that's probably been rotting since last month. This is the part of ancient warfare that never makes it into the dramatic oil paintings, because in reality, warships weren't constantly locked in thunderous naval clashes. Most of the time, they were just waiting, waiting for orders, waiting for the wind, waiting for the oarsmen to stop collapsing from exhaustion. So tonight, we'll slip aboard one of these vessels, stretch out on a splintering wooden bench, and quietly observe what life was really like when no heroic battles were happening, which was, most of the time. Let's begin with the ship itself. Imagine a trireme, the famous Greek warship, a sleek, terrifying weapon of the sea, until you actually climbed aboard it. Then, it was less fearsome and more floating torture device, rows upon rows of oars, three stacked levels of benches, and about 170 men crammed together in what can only be described as the ancient Mediterranean version of public transport. Except instead of being stuck for an hour, you were stuck for weeks. And instead of air conditioning, you had the unrelenting sun. Each oarsman had about as much personal space as you'd get in a modern budget airline seat. If you were lucky, their job was simple in theory, row when told. But in practice, it meant rowing in perfect synchronization for hours, while someone shouted at you in rhythm. The ancient version of a motivational playlist was a man banging a drum or yelling rope at the exact moment you least wanted to hear it. And of course, you weren't allowed to fall behind. If one oar lagged, the entire ship felt it. So if you were having a bad day, the guy next to you would kindly let you know by swearing in your ear. Now, you might imagine that these oarsmen were heroic warriors in training. But no, most of them were the ancient equivalent of day laborers. Some were even slaves. Others were poor citizens who'd rather be anywhere else. So picture a ship filled not with noble warriors, but with hundreds of grumpy men who smelled like anchovies and sweat, arguing over who stole whose piece of bread. But let's not forget the officers. On every ship, there was a captain. Theoretically, he was in charge of morale. In reality, he was in charge of yelling at everyone else. Captains often came from wealthier classes. They had the luxury of standing on deck, in the open air, while the oarsmen slowly marinated in the lower decks. If they got hot, they had shade. If they got hungry, they had food that wasn't crawling with bugs. And if they got bored, they could walk around pretending to inspect the ship, which meant, in practice, peering down at the rowers and nodding sagely, as if witnessing men slowly expire was some kind of leadership. And above even the captain was the triarch, the man who actually paid for the ship. This was usually a wealthy Athenian noble, fulfilling his civic duty. In theory, it was an honor. In practice, it was like being forced to buy the neighborhood sports team new uniforms every year. Except the uniforms were 120-foot-long warships that broke down constantly. Naturally, the triarch wasn't going to be the one rowing. He just showed up to look important, then probably went home to complain about how much it was all costing him. Now, daily life aboard the ship was limited. There wasn't much room. The ship was narrow, cramped, and barely had space for supplies. That meant food was simple: hard bread, dried fish, maybe some olives if you were lucky. Meals weren't feasts. They were more like survival rations, just enough to keep you alive, but never enough to stop the constant gnawing hunger. And let's address the elephant in the room: bathroom breaks. There were no bathrooms. If you needed to relieve yourself, you went over the side, which was easy enough if you were on the top deck, less so if you were on the bottom tier of rowers, wedged between two men, with an oar in your hand. So yes, the ship often smelled exactly as you're imagining. At night, the men didn't have cozy cabins. They usually slept on shore if possible, but if they had to stay aboard, they curled up where they sat, leaning against the oars, trying to ignore the sounds of the sea, the groaning wood, and the guy next to them snoring like a dying walrus. And what did they do when they weren't rowing or sleeping? Well, not much. There wasn't room for games. There weren't enough supplies for hobbies. So the main activity was complaining. They complained about the heat. They complained about the food. They complained about their officers, the rowing pace, the wind, the gods, each other's smell, basically everything. Some carved graffiti into the wood, leaving behind little doodles of ships, animals, or crude insults. Others sang songs, usually out of tune, and usually about how awful their lives were. If someone had dice, gambling would appear. Nothing passed the time like losing what little pay you'd earned to the man sitting next to you. And then, of course, there was religion. Men prayed constantly at sea, to Poseidon, to Zeus, to whichever god seemed most likely to listen. Sometimes, whole sacrifices were made before voyages, because apparently one goat's life was the only thing standing between you and a watery grave. Now, when it came to actual fighting, life didn't get much better. You might think naval battles were thrilling. In reality, they were terrifying chaos. Ships didn't fire cannons yet. They rammed. They tried to break each other's hulls. Or, more often, they just tried to get close enough for men to leap aboard and stab each other in a cramped brawl. The rowers rarely got glory in these battles. Their job was to row harder, faster, and straighter. If the ship went down, they were usually the first to drown, because climbing out of a sinking wooden cage with 170 panicked men around you is not exactly easy. And after the rare victory, well, don't expect much celebration. Usually, it just meant more rowing, more patrolling, more waiting around for orders. Let's pause for a moment and drift over to the Roman side of things. Roman warships, like their Greek predecessors, were also powered by endless rows of oars. But the Romans naturally made it more miserable, because of course they did. Roman rowers were often slaves or convicts, which meant you didn't just have exhausted laborers. You had exhausted laborers who were also chained to their benches. If the ship sank, well, so did they. And to make things even more delightful, Roman commanders sometimes believed in motivational whipping. So, if you thought rowing was bad in Greece, imagine doing it while someone enthusiastically reminded you to row faster by hitting you with a stick. Still, It wasn't all despair. Some sailors managed to find humor in their situation. There are ancient jokes scratched into walls about sailors mocking their captains. They joked about storms, about seasickness, about the endless boredom. Because when you've been stuck on the same bench for 3 days, sometimes laughing at your misery is the only thing left to do. And occasionally, there were little moments of joy. A breeze after a week of still air, a lucky catch of fresh fish, or the rare day when the captain actually gave out wine and everyone got just tipsy enough to forget they were trapped on a floating sweatbox. So what was life really like aboard an ancient warship? Not heroic, not glamorous. It was cramped, uncomfortable, exhausting, and smelly. The men who lived it weren't legends. They were ordinary people, stuck in extraordinary misery, trying to get through each day without collapsing. And yet, these ships ruled the seas for centuries. They carried empires, won wars, and built legends, not because they were comfortable, but because hundreds of anonymous rowers bent their backs and endured it. So next time you see a grand painting of a sleek ancient trireme cutting through the waves with perfect grace, remember the reality. 170 grumpy men, crammed together, sweating, swearing, and rowing endlessly toward a battle they probably didn't want to fight in the first place. And with that thought, let's quietly step off the ship, stretch our legs on the beach, and drift over to the next part of our journey through ancient naval life. So, let's drift away from the quiet misery of the daily rowing benches and into the noise of what happened when the rowing actually had a destination. Because, unfortunately, these ships weren't really built for leisure cruises. The point of dragging 100 men and 100 oars into the sea was, naturally, to ram those 100 men and their 100 oars into someone else. Now, when you think of naval battles, your mind probably drifts to cannons firing, sails steering, and the smell of gunpowder. That didn't exist yet. For thousands of years, the most dangerous thing a ship could bring to battle was its own pointy front end. Yes, the ancient solution to naval combat was essentially bumper cars at fatal speed. This was called ramming. Ships were designed with bronze-sheathed prows, heavy and sharp, for the express purpose of splintering the side of an enemy's hull. It was a bold idea, and like many bold ideas, it worked only about half the time. Because hitting a moving target on water with another moving target on water is not exactly precise. So battles often turned into a lot of circling, sudden lunges, and missed connections that looked less like war and more like a very violent attempt at synchronized swimming. And when ramming didn't do the job, there was always boarding. This was where sailors would leap, rather unhappily, from one unstable wooden deck to another, in hopes of fighting hand to hand. The idea sounds heroic, but it was mostly sweaty chaos. Men carrying shields and spears tried not to trip on wet planks, or simply fell into the sea. Keep in mind, many of them didn't know how to swim, which means a lot of naval casualties weren't from swords or arrows, but from the sheer inability to tread water. Of course, commanders tried to bring some style to the carnage. The Athenians, for example, were especially fond of a maneuver called the deepless. It meant weaving through the enemy's line of ships, then suddenly turning to smash their oars to pieces. If successful, the enemy vessel would be left helpless, spinning in the water, while everyone on board stared at their now very decorative but utterly useless set of splintered wood. The Romans, not to be outdone, preferred a more blunt solution. Since they weren't initially very good at naval maneuvers, they invented the corvus. This was basically a big wooden boarding plank with a metal spike on the end. They would drop it onto an enemy ship, pinning it in place, and then march across in their heavy armor, turning a sea battle into a land battle with extra drowning risk. It was simple, brutish, and very Roman, and naturally, it also made their ships a little more likely to tip over, which is exactly what happened in more than one campaign. We should also note that before gunpowder, projectiles still existed. Archers stood on decks, raining arrows across the water. Sometimes slingers joined in, hurling stones that could crack a helmet or dent morale. And in certain cultures, because humanity always finds a way, pitch, oil, or firepots were hurled to set enemy ships alight. The Byzantines later perfected this with Greek fire, an incendiary substance that famously kept burning even on water. It was the nightmare fuel of its day. But in the earlier centuries, most fleets made do with crude jars of flaming oil, which had a bad habit of falling short, bouncing back, or otherwise setting the wrong vessel on fire. There is something grimly amusing in imagining a commander yelling, "Throw the fire," only to watch his own deck start smoking. Still, despite the smoke and clashing wood, these battles were rarely quick. Two fleets could spend hours staring each other down, rowing back and forth, trying to outmaneuver in slow circles, all while the men on board shifted uncomfortably, sweating under helmets, and hoping their side wouldn't be the one suddenly reduced to splinters. And it wasn't just the men in combat who suffered. Naval warfare required immense logistics. For every dramatic ramming, there were weeks of gathering timber, building ships, and convincing thousands of farmers to temporarily become rowers. The expense was enormous, which is why most ancient states only launched full naval campaigns when they absolutely had to, because the reality of naval combat was less about glory and more about splinters, seasickness, and sinking very slowly while yelling at your oarsmen. So if you ever feel that your own job is a little tedious, picture a man in 400 BCE, ordered to row as fast as possible toward another ship, in the hope that the collision would either break the other hull, or merely break his own arms in the process. It's the kind of career path that made farming look positively luxurious. And on that note, let's drift gently toward the next curiosity, the ships themselves. Because while the men aboard were miserable, the ships they sat in were often bizarre feats of human ambition and questionable design. So, what kind of vessels carried these tired, sweaty, and usually unwilling men across the seas? Well, ancient naval engineers had a talent for ambition, paired with a slightly reckless disregard for practicality. It produced some truly strange ships. The most famous, of course, was the Greek trireme. Its name literally means 3 rows, because it had, very creatively, 3 stacked levels of oars. Picture a long, narrow wooden hull with 3 banks of exhausted men, each rowing in unison. That is, rowing in unison if the kelostess, the man shouting time, managed to keep them together. Otherwise, it looked a little more like a drunken centipede slapping at the water. The trireme was light, fast, and terrifying if you happened to be on the receiving end of its bronze-tipped prow. but it also had the durability of a wicker chair in a rainstorm. They had to be hauled ashore every night to keep the wood from warping. Leaving them in water too long made them soggy, which is not exactly a desirable quality for something meant to float. It's rather like discovering your sports car only works if you keep it in a garage every single night. But the Greeks weren't content with just 3 rows. Naturally, someone decided, why stop there? By the Hellenistic age, naval architects were building quadriremes and quinquiremes. That's 4 and 5 levels of oarsmen. Because if 3 banks of misery worked well, 5 must be better. These ships were bigger, heavier, and more intimidating. They also required even more men, which meant even more cramped benches, and even greater risk of the entire thing feeling like a floating oven by midday. And of course, there were the Ptolemies in Egypt. They never did anything halfway. They built some of the most excessive warships ever imagined, including one described as having 40 rows of oars. Now, historians still debate exactly what 40 meant in practice. It probably didn't mean 40 neat layers stacked on top of each other like a floating apartment block. But even so, it was enormous. It required thousands of men to row, steer, and generally curse their life choices. It was so large that it wasn't really a practical warship at all, more like a statement piece, the ancient equivalent of parking a superyacht in the harbor just to remind everyone how wealthy you were. And then there were the Romans. They inherited the quinquireme from the Carthaginians and promptly set about mass producing them, like the IKEA of naval warfare. They weren't particularly innovative at first. Rome wasn't a naval culture by instinct. But once they realized ships could be useful for conquering the Mediterranean, they simply churned them out. In true Roman fashion, quantity won over elegance. Their ships were solid, heavy, and reliable in the same way a stone wall is reliable. It worked, but it didn't exactly glide. Yet, despite all the grand designs, every ancient ship shared the same awkward truth. They were vulnerable. A single hole below the waterline could undo all the bronze fittings, all the painted eyes on the prow, all the boasts of a commander. Ships sank quickly, and salvage was nearly impossible. And the men inside, many of whom never learned to swim, often found the sea less of a battlefield and more of a watery grave. Still, naval architects couldn't resist showing off. We have accounts of galleys with gilded decorations, carved figureheads, and rows of painted shields mounted on the sides. Practical? No, but it looked impressive when rowing past a coastal village, because half the point of ancient ships wasn't fighting, but intimidation. A massive, brightly painted galley sliding into view was essentially a moving billboard that said, "Hello, we own the sea, and possibly your taxes." Of course, not all designs were so glamorous. Some fleets still used small, one-level galleys for scouting and quick raids. These were cramped, bare, and offered no chance for glory. Just a lot of rowing, a little bit of rainwater, and the occasional raid that ended with you stealing livestock instead of sinking ships. One imagines the sailors weren't especially thrilled about dedicating weeks of labor to come home with a goat. So, when we talk about ancient warships, we should keep in mind that they were equal parts weapon, political statement, and floating prison sentence. Every new row of oarsmen added meant one more layer of complaints, one more level of sweat, and one more reminder that ancient engineers loved ambition far more than comfort. And with that thought, let's drift gently onward. Because as strange as the ships were, the men who commanded them were often stranger. The admirals, the kings, the naval commanders who thought wooden battering rams were the height of strategic brilliance. These were characters worth dozing off to. So far, we've drifted with the horsemen. We've looked at the ships. Now, let's float up to the quarterdeck, where the admirals and kings stood, looking very self-important, while other people did all the sweating. Ancient naval leaders were rarely chosen for their sailing expertise. In fact, most of them couldn't sail at all. They were aristocrats, which usually meant their main qualifications were being rich, being related to someone richer, and owning a cloak that flapped dramatically in the wind. Because if there's one thing ancient elites adored, it was looking heroic while standing still. Take the Athenians. They were pioneers of naval warfare. Yes, but their admirals, called strategoi, were often political figures. Many had little interest in actual sailing. They relied on skilled helmsmen and petty officers to handle the technical parts. The admiral's real job was to make grand speeches, glare meaningfully across the water, and take credit for victories. If things went badly, of course, the rowers were blamed. Sometimes, the entire admiral was put on trial afterward. The Athenians had a nasty habit of executing commanders for losing battles, which made naval leadership about as appealing as volunteering to be a lightning rod. Then there were the Persians. They had huge fleets, supplied by their coastal subjects, Phoenicians, Egyptians, and Greeks who didn't want to be there. Persian kings liked to boast about commanding the sea, but most of them avoided actually sailing on it. Xerxes, for instance, preferred to sit on shore and watch, like a man too dignified to get sand between his toes. During the famous Battle of Salamis, he sat on a throne on a hill overlooking the strait, scribes beside him to record who fought bravely and who disappointed him. Imagine trying to row for your life while your monarch critiques your performance like a judge on a talent show. And the Romans. Ah yes, the Romans. They were never truly comfortable at sea. Their senators preferred land battles, where things felt solid. Still, they recognized the need for admirals, so they appointed men with impressive titles and very little actual knowledge. Some commanders were basically politicians in sandals, suddenly handed hundreds of ships. Unsurprisingly, this led to a long string of awkward blunders. At least the Romans were consistent. They believed discipline and numbers could make up for skill. And sometimes, surprisingly, it did. But perhaps the most entertaining naval egos belonged to the Hellenistic monarchs. Take Demetrius Poliorcetes, nicknamed the Besieger. He adored flashy naval displays. At one point, he commanded a fleet with ships so oversized they were practically floating palaces. They weren't very effective in actual battle, but they made a grand entrance. It's rather like showing up to a fencing match in full golden armor. You'll lose quickly, but everyone will remember how dazzling you looked. The Ptolemies in Egypt were equally fond of over-the-top naval egos. They built massive flagships with multiple decks, gilded decorations, and even gardens on board. Yes, gardens. Because when you're trying to ram an enemy vessel, nothing says military genius like a potted shrubbery behind you. These floating estates weren't really meant for combat. They were stage props for royal processions, meant to dazzle subjects and remind allies that Egypt could waste resources on the most impractical ideas possible. And then we have Cleopatra. When she sailed to meet Mark Antony at Tarsus, she turned the encounter into theater. Her barge had purple sails, silver oars, and musicians playing as she drifted up the river. This was less warship and more floating music video. Mark Antony naturally was captivated, and it worked, because naval power wasn't always about ramming holes in ships. It was about showing off. A magnificent barge could seduce more effectively than 1,000 arrows. But perhaps the most consistent quality among naval leaders, whether Greek, Roman, or Egyptian, was their overconfidence. Commanders often imagined they could control the sea with sheer willpower. Reality disagreed. Storms, currents, and the stubborn fact that ships break easily tended to ruin their grand strategies. Naval battles often came down less to genius leadership and more to which side's rowers collapsed last. Still, admirals strutted about as though they had bent the waves to their command. They had their names carved into victory monuments, while the thousands of oarsmen remained anonymous. History, as usual, remembered the cloaks, not the calluses. So when you picture an ancient naval commander, don't imagine a master of the sea. Picture a wealthy man standing very straight, pointing at things, while praying that his underpaid rowers didn't mutiny. That's much closer to the truth. And with that, let's gently turn the page and drift toward the battles themselves. Because as flawed as the leaders were, the clashes they orchestrated changed history. Not always for the better, but always in interesting, exhausting, and often very damp ways. So, as the oars kept pulling, and the sea never really changed its mind, life aboard those ships carried on in the same slow rhythm. The soldiers knew there would be long stretches where nothing much happened at all, and they adjusted in their own ways. Some dozed against the planks, others sharpened blades that didn't really need sharpening, and a few simply stared at the horizon as if expecting it to blink first. The officers, meanwhile, worked very hard at appearing busier than they truly were. Command, after all, is mostly a performance. A captain might stride across the deck, adjust his cloak dramatically, and then return to doing nothing of consequence. It was a kind of theater, but it reassured the men that someone, somewhere, knew what was happening. Let's start with food, because naturally, people always worry about food. When we picture ancient navies, we imagine banquets, salted meat, exotic spices, but the truth was usually less glamorous. On a warship, food was dry, hard, and lasted just long enough to keep a man alive. Sailors chewed through barley biscuits so solid they could double as roof tiles. They softened them in water, or wine if they were lucky, but more often they just gnawed at them until their gums bled. And if that sounds unpleasant, it's because it was. But sailors did develop little tricks to make things tolerable. Some would scrape off mold before eating. Others would dunk their bread until it turned into something resembling porridge. And of course, there was always wine. Not the kind of wine you pay for at a restaurant. Not even the kind your cousin makes in his garage. This was sour, watered down, sometimes already turning to vinegar. Protein was harder to come by. Fresh meat? Forget it. That was a luxury for the captain, and even he rarely saw it once the ship had been gone more than a week. Fish could be caught, but not as easily as we like to imagine. Ancient warships weren't floating fishing docks. Nets took up space, and hooks required bait. And when you had 200 men crammed into a narrow deck, there simply wasn't room for leisurely fishing sessions. So rations were mostly salted meat, dried beans, and occasionally cheese, although cheese had the problem of turning rancid almost as quickly as the sailors themselves. Still, when you're hungry enough, you eat it anyway. And of course, stomach problems followed. Diaries and surviving records from later periods complain constantly of sailors' bowels rebelling against their diet. Ancient men would not have been any luckier. Imagine a crowded wooden ship, no privacy, no plumbing, and 200 men with bad stomachs. Yes, it smelled exactly like you think it did. You don't need a historian to tell you that. Let's drift away from the mess deck and wander up to the rowers. Life down in the benches was its own kind of slow-motion nightmare. You sat shoulder to shoulder with men who smelled as bad as you did. You pulled at a heavy oar, day after day, blister after blister, often with little variation. The rhythm of rowing was set by a flute player or a drummer, because apparently ancient commanders knew that the best way to keep tired, cranky men working was to treat them like slightly more muscular metronomes. The music was steady, sometimes even hypnotic, and the men rode in time, endlessly, staring at the back of the man in front of them. But not every moment was grueling. In calmer stretches, when the wind carried the ship and the oars could rest, sailors found ways to entertain themselves. Gambling was as old as humanity, and soldiers never traveled without dice or small carved pieces for games. Men would crowd together on the deck, crouched over a little board scratched into the wood, muttering, cheering quietly, groaning when luck failed. Others told stories, long sagas, exaggerated tales of heroes and monsters. The sea was always a stage for imagination, and when your daily reality was monotonous, the urge to make your life sound grander came naturally. And let's not forget singing. Soldiers sang when they were bored, when they were rowing, when they were drunk, and sometimes when they just wanted to drown out the creaking timbers. No one wrote down the songs of ordinary rowers 2,000 years ago, which is a shame, because they would probably tell us more about real life than all the king's inscriptions combined. But we can safely assume they were crude, catchy, and designed to be yelled more than sung. Think less national anthem, more drunken football chant. Another way sailors passed time was, of course, complaining. Letters from later navies show that men never stopped grumbling about their food, their pay, their officers, or their general lack of comfort. Ancient sailors would have been no different. The human urge to moan about life is older than the pyramids, and on a cramped ship it was practically the only form of recreation available. Now let's drift to hygiene, or rather, the almost complete lack of it. Bathing was not exactly a daily occurrence. Water was precious, and soap was a rare luxury. Men rinsed off with sea water when they could, which left them sticky with salt and chafing against their clothes. Shaving was rare, trimming even rarer. Lice were constant companions, and fleas and rats joined the party for free. The rats thrived on scraps of grain and crumbs of biscuit, and sailors couldn't do much about them except try not to notice. So when you read poetic descriptions of mighty fleets sailing under the sun, just remember that below deck, half the men were scratching at bites and cursing the vermin. And then there was sleep. Resting on a warship was always a challenge. Men slept where they could, on benches, against the mast, curled under a sail. Privacy was non-existent, noise was constant, and the smell was, well, we've covered the smell. If you were lucky, the rocking waves might lull you to sleep. If not, you just lay there, listening to the creaks and snores and occasional splash over the side as someone dealt with bad fish. Of course, officers had it easier. They had actual quarters, not luxurious ones, but spaces that at least belonged to them. A small bed, a chest for personal items, maybe a bit of decoration. And while the ordinary sailor was chewing moldy bread, the officers could enjoy slightly fresher food, maybe even a piece of fruit, which instantly made them the envy of everyone else on board. Naturally, this did not make them popular, but rank had its privileges, and navies were no different. Sometimes, to break the monotony, there were drills, practicing maneuvers, rehearsing for combat, or simply cleaning and maintaining the ship, scrubbing the deck, patching sails, repairing ropes. These jobs never ended because wood rots, ropes fray, and sails tear with the slightest excuse. And of course, officers loved drills because they made them feel useful. The sailors, however, probably just rolled their eyes and muttered into their beards. Discipline was another feature of life at sea. Rules existed, and punishments followed if they were broken. Stealing rations, fighting, or refusing to row could lead to beatings. Or worse, on land, you might run away from your commander. On a ship, there was nowhere to run. The ocean was the perfect prison wall, so men mostly stayed in line because the alternative was punishment or the sea, and neither was particularly appealing. Religion played its part too. Sailors were famously superstitious. They whispered prayers to sea gods, carried charms, and performed little rituals before dangerous journeys. An unexpected wave or a sudden storm was never just bad weather. It was a sign that someone had angered a god. So sacrifices were offered, libations poured, and promises made. In moments of fear, tough soldiers became very devout indeed, because when you're far from home on a wooden boat, suddenly every god seems worth believing in. And through all this, time stretched. Days blurred into nights, and nights into days. The horizon remained the same, flat and endless. Men stared at the water, lost in thought, or argued about nonsense just to fill the silence. Ancient warships were tools of war, yes, but they were also floating waiting rooms, carrying men from one dull day to the next until the moment finally came when they were ordered to fight. That's the truth of it. Life on board wasn't glorious. It wasn't cinematic. It was repetitive, uncomfortable, and sometimes downright miserable. But it was also ordinary. These men laughed, joked, cursed, played games, and told stories. They bonded over misery, because nothing brings people together quite like shared suffering. And while their names are mostly forgotten, their daily lives were the real backbone of ancient warfare. The kings and generals may have made the decisions, but it was the sailors, hungry, tired, and slightly seasick, who carried those decisions across the seas. So when you imagine an ancient warship gliding through the water, try not to picture a heroic painting. Picture instead 100 weary men chewing stale bread, scratching at lice, muttering at their officers, and singing slightly off-key songs just to make the day go by a little faster. because that was life, really. And somehow, through it all, they managed to keep rowing.